Senator Nelson was here. However, they called a vote. And so for those of you who know me, I actually just recently left the Senate about 6 months ago, and so I used to work for Bill Nelson for the past 8 years, doing the science and space policy on the Commerce Committee. But as many of you know who live in this town and members have come to speak at events, when votes get called, that is that. So he was here, hung out the back for a while, and he ran back to vote. But he left his staff here. And prior to 6 months ago, that would have been me to fill the void. But now we have new people to fill the void. So I'll just say a few words about, well, I had a very witty, humorous introduction planned, but there's one part that's still relevant, and that's with regard to my successor on the committee working for the senator. And so, we heard a lot today. We started with Administrator Bolden talking this morning about the challenges of getting to Mars and NASA's plans of getting to Mars. And Senator Nelson actually flew with the administrator on Shuttle Crew 61C. So it was nice. We were going to start and end the day with members of Shuttle Crew 61C. But in the talks we've heard today, many of you heard John Grunsfeld say that actually the legislative challenges or legislative changes were actually harder than getting to Mars. And I'm sure that Nick will tell us a little bit about that. And certainly from my experience, that is the case. We heard about other challenges as well, both technical and political. And some of you have heard me refer to the political challenges as political engineering. And you've also heard me say that political engineering is just as necessary for advancements in the nation's space program as just about anything in aerospace engineering. So as I mentioned, I worked for Senator Bill Nelson for 8 years on the Commerce Committee. And he is referred to by some of his colleagues as Senator Space. He can really turn a conversation about just about anything into a conversation about space, and works very hard for NASA day in and day out. And actually, Nick Cummings, who's my successor on the committee, I think when he was a fellow up from KSC many years ago working with me in the Senate, and I think it was day 3 on Nick's job that we were sitting in the senator's office and we had just briefed him on that year's annual appropriations bill. And the senator didn't like the numbers that he heard, and so he was instantly on the phone making calls to his colleagues to up the budget numbers for NASA for that year's appropriations bill. And Nick leans over and whispers to me and says, "Does he work this hard for NASA every day?" And I said, "Pretty much." So when that day comes that we put feet on Mars, the senator will be just as instrumental in getting us there as any engineer who is making the plans and turning the wrench. And so very apologies that he cannot be here. Again, he was here, but when those votes get called, he had to go. So with that, I will introduce his science or space advisor on the committee, Nick Cummings.
I'm not that guy, if you guys hadn't figured that out yet. Thank you, Ann. Again, I want to give my regrets on behalf, Senator Nelson's regrets. He was here. We knew it was going to be really tight. There was a, thanks. Lest anybody mistake me for a senator or for Ann Zolkowski. Yeah, oh, trust me. I am not Ann. I am the new Ann, as I get called sometimes. Now she's going to stand up and say, "You're no Ann." At any rate, when these kinds of things happen with votes, it can be very dynamic, and we thought the best thing to do was going to be to squeeze him in and have him run back for the vote, and we just got the timing wrong. But I do want to take a minute to tell you a little bit about what he would have said. He would have had some colorful stories. We always make sure when we're talking to him about remarks, he always has something he wants to say that we never know what it's going to be until he gets here, but it's usually some sort of personal story about the space program. It means a whole lot to him personally. Senator Nelson really believes, and I think we all believe, that it's in our very nature to explore new frontiers. We have a deep human need to push boundaries. Our curiosity naturally compels us to wonder and to discover. And I think we all believe that the next step in our adventure is to get humans to Mars, and that's what we're all here to discuss. Mars, our curiosity of Mars is nothing new. We've studied the planet for thousands of years. Ancient civilizations in China, Babylon, and Egypt all watched the planet closely, recording its position and movement in the sky. And 400 years ago, Galileo viewed the red planet through one of the world's very first telescopes. And over the next century, earlier astronomers recorded the planet's size, rotation, the polar ice caps, and other surface features. And after millennia of staring at Mars with wonder and fascination, on July 20th of 1976, NASA began the next phase of our exploration with the successful landing of Viking 1. In the years that have followed, we've learned from Viking, Pathfinder, Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity, along with a host of orbiters, that Mars was once warm and wet, flowing with rivers and lakes and perhaps a vast ocean. As we unravel the mysteries of the red planet, it is the search for life that most fascinates us. Did life evolve on ancient Mars? The answer to that question will change how we view our place in the universe, regardless of the answer. Perhaps life springs up wherever conditions are right, and our solar system is teeming with exotic life forms waiting to be discovered, or as we heard in the last panel, invaded by our own microbiomes. Or perhaps our fragile home planet and the life that inhabits it is even more special than we realize, and the solar system is not teeming with life. It does not just spring up on every celestial surface where there is liquid water. The NASA authorization, either way, the answer to the question, I think, is very fundamental to our existence. So the NASA authorization of 2010 states that a long-term objective for the human exploration of space should be the eventual international exploration of Mars. So this is law. This is the existing policy set forth in the NASA authorization of 2010 that Senator Nelson authored along with Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, and passed with unanimous consent in the Senate and with an overwhelming majority in the House. So it is fair to say that there is broad political consensus that the exploration of Mars is the goal of our human exploration, and that's actually set forth in law. The act also directed NASA to strive for a permanent human presence beyond low Earth orbit and authorized key components to make the program achievable and sustainable: the Space Launch System Heavy Lift Rocket, the Orion capsule, advanced propulsion systems. If Senator Nelson was here, this is where he would talk about Franklin Chang Diaz and the Vasmir rocket engine that he is very much fascinated with. Advanced propulsion systems and habitation modules, all of these components were outlined in the blueprint of the 2010 authorization. The act also extended the utilization of the International Space Station so that NASA could continue to develop the technologies and understanding of human physiology needed for a human mission to Mars. Furthermore, it encouraged development of a robust commercial space capabilities featuring the space station as both a destination and as an incubator for privately funded research in space. This is actually a critical component of the exploration architecture, the notion of commercial industry taking over low Earth orbit so that NASA can push further out into the solar system. So this notion of sending a human mission to Mars is nothing new. NASA has studied such a mission since the times of von Braun. So what makes our current effort different? So the one thing that's different is that this isn't a study. We're putting all the key components of a human mission to Mars into place right now. SLS is moving from design to production, and that's the farthest we've come to replacing the capabilities of the Saturn V since the Saturn V flew. And Orion completed its first test flight flawlessly late last year. Kennedy Space Center's historic launch facilities are being completely renovated and reshaped, and we've got contracts in place for development of advanced propulsion and habitation systems. We've also got cargo being delivered to the ISS under service contracts with the commercial industry, and as a byproduct, we're seeing a revolution in the commercial launch industry, with the United States taking the global commercial launch market by storm. Finally, we have emerging domestic launch capabilities to end our reliance on Russian rockets for national security launches as well. And that's what makes this time different than any of the previous efforts to reach Mars. All of the components needed to set us on a sustainable path towards the human exploration of Mars. And I say that, that's not a throwaway word. The sustainable path towards the human exploration of Mars, all of those components are moving forward. We do struggle, I think, with the resources that we need to accomplish it. Many outside commissions have looked at the budget of NASA and have said we asked the agency to do too much with too little. And the solution is not necessarily reprioritizing funding within NASA. We don't need to rob Peter to pay Paul. NASA is and has always been a multi-mission agency. We know that the budgets of the Apollo program are a thing of the past, but it is reasonable to consider funding levels that would see a robust, balanced budget across the agency. The senator believes that this is achievable and fights for it every single day. And it appears the public agrees. According to a poll commissioned by ExploreMars, it seems that a majority of Americans believe that we can land human on Mars in the early 2030s and that we can increase and should increase NASA's budget to reach that goal. So I assume that many of you are here today because you already support a human mission to Mars. And to the extent to which I've been preaching to the choir and probably telling you stuff that you already know, what I would encourage you to do is come over to the Hill and visit with us in the Senate and in the House, and encourage them and convince them that it's time to take the next step in extending the reach of humanity. The exploration of Mars, the human exploration of Mars, is much closer than it's ever been, and what we need the most is to stay the course towards that goal. We need to execute the programs that we've authorized, and in pursuing this goal, we will challenge our imaginations and redefine what's possible. The exploration of Mars is truly a part of the American dream, and we can share it for generations to come. So I am happy I've butchered the agenda. Are there any questions? So the question was, how likely will stay the course and don't screw up be followed by Congress? I guess one thing that I'll point out, and it's hard to handicap these kinds of things, but one thing that I'll point out is that space policy tends to be advanced by consensus and by a large group of well, I guess large is relative, but by a group of members in both the House and the Senate who care deeply about the exploration of space. The extent to which we unite those communities and keep them all on the same page, I think is very helpful. When we divide those communities, either on partisan lines or because of competing priorities within our civil space portfolio, where we pit planetary science against human exploration or Earth observation against planetary science or any number of subdivisions, you lose the critical mass you need to advance the agency. So what I would say is the words that I read to you from the NASA authorization of 2010 were passed with unanimous consent in the Senate. That means all, well, it probably wasn't all 100, maybe 90 something, whoever was there, all members agreed to it. And it was a very, very large majority in the House. So there is a very, very strong bipartisan consensus behind the policy direction that's in place right now. And I do think that we have a fighting chance of staying that course, but that is dependent and contingent on the programs that we've authorized performing, hitting their milestones, and taking things a step at a time. But I think it's actually quite reasonable, at least from a congressional perspective. The administrations always want to put their fingerprints on things, and I think that's always a challenge, is to figure out how an incoming administration can have an identity from a space policy perspective without it always being a massive changing course. Any other questions?
Yes, I'd like to ask, the 210 law, this authorization, but it's about an international exploration. Have all the other countries that are involved with space exploration signed this?
No, the NASA authorization of 2010 is a U.S. law. It's a U.S. public law. So that would not be endorsed necessarily by other international entities. However, what we've seen from the international working groups that NASA is engaged in, the policy that law sets forth for our space agency, I think is very much in line with what they are willing, or what they would like to do from an international cooperation perspective. So that's probably just about it for the answer to that question, I think. China, right. So a good question. The Chinese have expressed an interest to certainly robotic exploration of the moon, to a low Earth orbit human-tended space station, and I believe to human exploration of the moon too. We currently do not cooperate bilaterally with China on space. So there haven't been, there's no bilateral, there's actually prohibitions, statutory prohibitions against bilateral cooperation with China in space.
This is about funding, long-term funding. Going to Mars, we need 20 years of funding and a commitment to continue forward. You can't stop midway and say, well, we're not going to continue the mission, they'll have to just come back. So, when we decided to go to the moon, we did have a commitment for 10 years or so. I don't know how that was conceived or executed. Where we are now in a very partisan environment, how do we create such a plan in relative to funding and commitment long-term to actually go to Mars?
Thank you. Okay, that's a great question. So I don't think that you would ever see as a percentage of GDP or even in inflation-adjusted dollars, the funding for the Apollo program was actually not a sustained investment. It was a really big spike that happened over a couple of years. So when you go look at it over time, it wasn't a sustained investment of a significant portion of GDP for 10 years. It was a huge spike with a big up ramp and a big down ramp, which is actually extremely inefficient. But it worked. It got the job done. I think what we're talking about for humans to Mars is actually looking at sustaining the budget that NASA gets and has been getting for decades, that has been sustained. And I think that there are modest, within a couple of percent, inflation plus a couple of percent a year type increases that could be reasonable, but they require the public to make it known that that's what they want. So all of these members of Congress, all of these senators have constituents that they have to answer to, and I think the extent to which they are supportive of such an effort makes it very possible. It's certainly affordable from our country's perspective. NASA's budget is, as most of you know, between 4 and 0.5% per year of the federal budget. So a relatively modest increase to NASA's budget is probably not that noticeable in the scheme of the federal budget. It's just a question of people asking for it. Yeah, I think there's people who have made estimates like that. I don't think that would be the course of the path that we would probably want to pursue. I think that we've seen estimates, and again, that's the idea of when I talk about the exploration of Mars being on a sustainable path. There's been many proposed ways to get people to Mars, and some of them have been hugely expensive. We could probably spend about as much money as we wanted to trying to get people to Mars. But no, we need to find some of the realistic architectures and mission approaches that we've seen that are achievable with within NASA's budget, adjusted for inflation, or at most with very modest adjustments to NASA's budget. I think those are all very realistic and achievable. I think the important thing, I'm sorry, to your point about that, is the important thing is that you're not throwing money away every 3 or 4 years because you start with a different approach. I think there's a quote about growing carrots or growing root vegetables or something, that if you pull them up every couple of weeks to see how they're doing, you're not gonna get a very healthy vegetable at the end of the season.
I would like to address your question because I think it's very pertinent. Yes, there are numbers out there that go like $500 billion. You know, it's inconceivable amounts of money. It's a bit like if I plan my wedding, I could do it for, many millions, or I could have a really great party for somewhere around between 10 to 15. And then that's the same with Mars, actually. As you all are aware, if we bring a satellite or a robot or a lander to Mars, we do precise calculations. If we do bring Scott Kelly to the ISS, we just don't send him there and think, oh, we'll get the bill in 2 years' time and we'll see what it is, because, that's not how it's done. The same way people have been calculating quite precisely what it would really cost to get humans to Mars. Now, of course, there are some uncertainties in the sense that we haven't exactly built all the infrastructure yet, and so that might, give certain fluctuations, but it basically means, and Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's probably doable to do it with precursor missions like we did Apollo and Gemini before we actually put Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong on the moon, for about 100 billion in 20 years' time. That's about 5 billion per year. That would fall within the NASA human spaceflight budget. And yes, can I say that to you, although you're not the senator? Yeah,
I am not.
Yeah, I know.
The senator.
But it's like, if you give
Thank you
NASA
for making that point again.
19, it's 18 billion, and there is a proposal on the books for about almost 19 billion in budget for the whole of NASA. So not for Mars or the moon or whatever, but the whole budget. And to be honest, if you would bring NASA up to about 20 billion and stay the course for the next 20 years, and 20 billion is for everything, it's for going to Mercury, to Jupiter, to Mars and everything. Science and all the other things, about 80 missions that NASA is doing beside this idea of us getting humans to Mars. We could do it, and that's why we keep asking, stay the course and don't screw up. And the don't screw up is, don't pull up the vegetables and see whether the carrots are doing well. and so don't change your mission architecture every 4 or 5 years.
And I think there's another point you made there that's important, and that's that we're talking about a multi-decadal program. And so the numbers always sound big when you add it up over decades and you include inflation. It's the old adage about compound interest, right? It's the same thing for inflation. So when you take NASA's budget and you inflate it to 2035 in those dollars, it looks enormous, right? And those are just, those are some of the kinds of things that end up making these numbers sound way more unpalatable than they actually are. Do we have another?
Right here.
Oh, Jeff.
The House earlier this year passed an authorization bill for 2015, and the House Science Committee marked up one for 2016 and 2017. One, can we expect anything on the Senate side in terms of an authorization? And two, particularly for this audience, there's language in those authorization bills requiring NASA to provide a detailed roadmap for human exploration of Mars, presumably more detailed than the Journey to Mars documentation they provided so far. Would you expect to see something like that in a Senate bill?
So let me start in backwards order. I think that there's a lot of members who are very, very interested in understanding how all of the different pieces and all of the different missions that NASA is looking at in the first few years or in the next few years of the program fit into the grander scheme of exploration. So from that perspective, whether you call it a roadmap, there's probably a number of different ways that NASA can do that and help the members and stakeholders to understand how all of the pieces fit into the broader context. So I do think there's a lot of interest in doing something, whether that ends up being reporting language, whether it ends up being through a series of hearings, or other types of ways that we have of getting that information from NASA and from the industrial base and communicating it to the members and stakeholders. I do think there's a lot of interest in that. The timing on a Senate NASA bill, right now we have been working in a bipartisan manner on a commercial space bill. That effort is coming to a head here in fairly short order, and then we'll be working with Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Peters, Senator Nelson, to see what a NASA authorization might look like. There's a lot of different options in terms of how comprehensive that bill would be and how long the funding time frame would be associated with it, and we're still discussing all those options, so I don't have much of a better option to give you than that, or a better explanation to give you than that, Jeff. All right, we're done? Okay, thank you. Come find me, and I'll be happy to answer your question.